If you're anything like me or a human being, I'm sure the thought has flown through your head, I wish I could erase that situation from my memory. Maybe it was too hard, maybe something happened, maybe we even wished it hadn't happened. There was even a movie made about it, Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, I think it was. But even aside from sometimes some of us wishing things didn't happen, there's actually other people who have other responses. Like, I wish nobody would ever go through what I just went through, but I would not change it. I grew from it, I learned from it, and because of it, I am who I am today. When we think about big traumatic moments in our lives, we think kind of along those same thoughts. Trauma happens, something happens. By the way, what's trauma? The latest definition I heard is when you go through an event, no matter how big or small, and for you, you don't possess the tools to be able to actually process it. So it doesn't necessarily even matter what it is. And if you're on TikTok just a little bit, you'll hear people talking about trauma and post-trauma and how do we respond and all sorts of stuff. Well, I will posit at you that some of that's true and some of that's people using psychological language to talk about what worked in their life. But to go back to, does trauma happen and how do we respond? I will say that sometimes trauma happens, it's overwhelming, and we have a post-traumatic response. And it does change us, but not for the better. Sometimes it happens and we resiliently bounce back to where we were, not necessarily growing from it. And sometimes it happens and we use it for post-traumatic growth, which is a newer term that I actually recently learned. And that's the one I want to focus on tonight, is the post-traumatic growth. I think many of us can agree we've had things that have happened to us, bumps along the way, or what we thought of was a bump, only to realize because of that experience, I grew. It forced me to change. What caused that growth? Well, psychologists tell us that we do a few things. We ruminate on it, but not in the scary way, in the good way. We think through it. We identify ourselves with a community and recognize we're not alone. We realize maybe we're going to change something about ourselves, and in the end, we come out and create a narrative that's much more positive about what happened. Moses himself went through something not akin to traumatic in the sense of horrible, scary, and yet I would also say definitely massive. He had this encounter we read in this week's portion with God. And I'll remind you that words around that very encounter are filled with awe. Awe meaning amazing, awe meaning fear-inspiring. And he was up with God for 40 days and for 40 nights. And he came down a changed human being. It says that he came down and his face was aglow, and he had karnaim, or horns, or rays, shining off from him, around him, onto others. Because he wasn't the same Moses before, and he never went back. From that moment on, we see Moses taking almost a more profound role of leadership. He faces the challenge of the golden calf. And while he doesn't respond perfectly, he pushes them to no longer engage in idolatrous ways, but to truly be monotheistic. The other thought I had was that not only does Moses do that, we as an entire people, when challenged, do change. If we look at some of the prophetic works before the destruction of the first temple, we can read and we can see all these warnings, don't do this, don't stray off the path. And then we see Ezekiel comes along and talks to us about we should be ashamed with what we did. Kind of beating ourselves up, but I think he's in that phase of post-traumatic growth where we're ruminating on what did it mean what we went through, and how can we avoid that situation in the future, and what can he do to propel us to be different. We can see that not only did Moses radiate and Ezekiel changed, but all throughout time, we can witness these wonderful inflection points as a people and see that in all of those moments of change, we had scary times. We didn't know what was going to happen. And I would argue we're at one of those inflection points now. Synagogue attendance, it's down a little bit. People identifying with Judaism, I don't know. Anti-Semitism, way up. What's happening is fascism, it seems to be, and authoritarianism seems to be growing. And don't forget about climate change and what's happening in the Middle East. Are we gonna look at this moment as an inflection point for growth? Are we gonna sit and ruminate about what can we learn? How can we face the world around us? Or are we going to sit back and get scared again? I would say that what happened to Moses happens in many regards to all of us. What happened to us as a Jewish people happens to us as an individual. If I were to really ask you to think back, you may have a moment in your life that you grew from, that because you went through that experience, you're not the same person. What a gift that was. Of course, we don't want that pain onto anybody. But maybe, just maybe, we can look at all sorts of experiences as opportunities for change, opportunities for growth, and opportunities to form a stronger and better community. May this inflection point that we find ourselves in and have us be more like Moses descending from the mountain, and not as much like Aaron turning inward with the golden calf. May we be inspired to cooperate into larger communities, just like the exiles did after the destruction of the first temple, and not find ourselves wanting to be tribalistic, like we were before its destruction, when we also were faced with fear. May we be able to grow into our highest selves. Shabbat Shalom.